Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. When I was, as I was making the trip to Dhaka on the plane, I read in this magazine, The Economist, there was a review of a book, Why Liberalism Failed. Why Liberalism Failed. And the reviewer was, there is a nice quote from the reviewer which sums up the problem of modernity, that the founding tenets of liberalism have failed. Equality of opportunity has produced a new meritocratic autocracy that has all the aloofness of the old aristocracy with none of the sense of noblesse oblige. Democracy has degenerated into a theatre of the absurd, and technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. The gap between liberalism's claims about itself and the lived reality of the citizenry is now so wide that the lie can no longer be accepted. So basically what this quote is suggesting is that, well, for example, it says that democracy has become, such a joke. It's an absurd meaninglessness. More importantly, technology has reduced more and more areas of work to such, great degree of specialization that the whole process of work is a terrible burden. You think about the vast majority of people who go to office, who go to the factories, they work from 8, 10, 12 hours a day doing work that they're not interested in. Please think about that, as I proceed. I will come back to that point. Now, my main argument is that the central problem of modernity is not secularism as it refers to the problem of the secular state, but more the problem of nihilism. It is a problem of the human condition of humanity, not just Muslims. Now, in order to make this point, I would like to discuss in broad terms the critique of modernity, and also at the end make reference to Nursi's position. Now, from the 19th century onwards, social thinkers and theorists and philosophers paid attention to the problems of modernity. Thinkers like Marx, Weber and Durkheim brought attention to the manner in which modernity had failed to bring about the promises of the Enlightenment. The whole idea of the Enlightenment was to release human beings from all kinds of oppression, from political oppression from nature. So the Enlightenment, through science, would enable human beings to scientifically, rationally harness nature for the good of human beings. It would also help humans to construct more just economic systems, more just political systems. This was the promise of the Enlightenment and the promise of rationality. Now, this was the Enlightenment. But by the 19th century, many thinkers in Europe began to believe that the promises of the Enlightenment were not fulfilled, because there were new forms of slavery, new forms of drudgery, of difficult life that people started to experience, or people that it was realized that people were experiencing. Marx spoke about the problem of alienation. Max Weber spoke of the problem of slavery in the iron cage of rationality. Durkheim spoke about anomie. I will come back to this later. But a basic point, I think, that was made by Max Weber, and this brings us close to Nursi, that modern capitalist society was characterized by the excessively formal rationalization or bureaucratization of life, which Max Weber referred to as disenchantment. Now, this disenchantment is what Nursi refers to when he says that minds have become strangers to non-material explanations. That means God had been taken out of the equation, and any explanation of anything in reality that resorts to God or to the divine is something strange to people. That's what Nursi means when he says minds have become strangers to non-material explanations. Now, this then brings us to the topic of secularism. Now, I'm going fast here, and I'm being rather concise because there's no time to go into the details. My point about I want to make a point about secularism, that what is contrary to Islam is secularism as an ideology, and the idea of the secular itself is not contrary to Islam.
Dr. Farid,
yes.
Other sessions, you can go up to 30 minutes.
Yes, I know, but even then I don't have much time, so this is already almost 10 minutes gone. Thank you. I would argue that the idea of the secular state is not against Islam. In fact, I would argue that Muslims it is far better for Muslims to live in a secular state than in an Islamic state. Because the conception of the Islamic state that is widespread, that is popular today, the modernist idea, well, the idea of an Islamic state is a modernist idea anyway. But the contemporary idea of the Islamic state, the kinds of ideologues who propagate the idea of the Islamic state, that idea of the Islamic state is extremely problematic. It tends to be authoritarian, and if we look at real life existing Islamic states, they are authoritarian or totalitarian. They are extremely brutal states, and they're very intellectually backward states. So it seems to me that Muslims can live a more Islamic life and a freer life in secular states, particularly democratic secular states. But I would still prefer an authoritarian secular state to a so-called Islamic secular state. So this is my position about the secular state. The problem really is for Muslims. Now, the problem for Muslims is not living in a secular state which takes a position of neutrality towards religion. A secular state that is hostile to religion, like the Republic of Turkey in the past, or arguably some European states are becoming more hostile to religion. This is another matter. But states that are secular in the sense of being neutral to religion, I think are probably the best options that Muslims have today. In between, on the one hand, totalitarian Islamic states, and on the other hand, hostile secular states. Now, when I say secularism, when I'm talking about secularism, I'm not talking about the secular state, but rather secularism as a philosophy and worldview. But still, I'd like to make a further distinction. Secularism is distinct from nihilism, although secularism might lead to nihilism, and indeed there is an affinity between secularism and nihilism. But secularism itself is not nihilism, and it does not necessarily lead to nihilism. And I would argue, most importantly, that it is not the worst aspect of modernity. To me, the worst aspect of modernity is nihilism. And I'm saying that because I think Muslims have, for several decades, been obsessed with the problem of secularism, and I'm not saying there aren't problems with secularism, but I think we also need to talk about nihilism. And I feel that Nursi's concern was actually nihilism rather than secularism per se. Now, I mentioned earlier that since the 19th century, some thinkers, I mentioned Marx favored Durkheim as sociologists, but philosophers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, of course this 20th century, and many thinkers have been concerned with the issue of the human condition in modernity. Now, one of the conditions that was discussed as a problem of the human condition is the idea that life is meaningless and absurd. There is nothing more. Now here we are coming to the definition of nihilism. There's nothing more to the universe than its materialist nature. It is a self-running entity with no intelligent cause, no God. Humans are also material in nature. As there is no God, social norms, ethics, values, and so on are all social constructions. There are no consequences of violating them. There are no consequences of violating norms since there is no God and there is no afterlife. Furthermore, since humans are not spiritual but material beings, they are deterministic beings like machines or animals and are not responsible for their actions. Crime, perversion, and immorality are not to be blamed on people, as people are simply what they are. Their being branded as deviants and perverts is merely a human construction. Morality is merely relative to geography and culture, and not universally absolute. There is no purpose or meaning in life. Now here we have this distinction between existential nihilism and ethical nihilism, which I will come to in a short while. So basically, the idea is that life is like a novel in which there is no plot. There is no plot in the novel. There is just an assembly of words which have no meaning. Therefore, there's no point in even reading the novel, right? Now, the idea that life is absurd. There is, in other words, there's a contradiction between what we want to see in the world, what we expect in the world, and what the world actually gives us, what we actually find. So we expect a lot of things in the world. We expect consistency, we expect morality, we expect justice, we expect fairness. But what we find in the world are all the opposites, right? We see immorality, we see hypocrisy, and so on and so forth. We see pointlessness, and therefore we find that, or what the thinkers say and what people experience indeed is a pointlessness in life and even chaos. The sense of the meaninglessness and absurdity of life leads to a feeling of hopelessness and despair. And the idea of despair, yas, in Arabic, is something that Nursi spoke about. And in fact, Nursi spoke about despair in a very different way from the people who preceded him. Because the scholars that preceded him in pre-modern period spoke about despair in a Sufi context. Whereas, the idea of yas. But in Nursi's case, he was talking about it in the context of living in a modern society filled with despair and a sense of hopelessness regarding what life could actually deliver to humans. Now, despair, of course, is a consequence of nihilism. Now, I mentioned before existential and what did I say? Existential and moral nihilism. Now, the idea that life is not significant, there's no significance to life, we delude ourselves into believing life has meaning. So the existentialists say that we should be honest and affirm the absurdity of existence, including that we will eventually die. and that religion and metaphysics are merely results of the fear of death. It's the death anxiety that leads us to create metaphysical theories and theological doctrines about the nature of reality, about God, and so on. So this is what is known as existential nihilism. Meaning is merely subjectively created. Life has no intrinsic meaning or value. Now, moral nihilism is something a bit different. It says that it is connected to existential nihilism. Moral nihilism says that morality does not inherently exist, and that our moral codes and values are all social constructions. Now, one of the important ideologues of nihilism is a man called the Marquis de Sade. You know, the Marquis de Sade from France. Sade, his name is de Sade, D-E-S-A-D-E. No, so his name is the word from which we get the term sadism or sadomasochism, right? So the Marquis de Sade was a man who believed in these ideas. You know, he was a nihilist. He believed that morality was a mere human construction, and that human beings had the right to act as they wished if they had the power. So he practiced, for example, violent sex. You know, he would rape women, and he would practice various forms of sexual violence with women. And he said that he had the right to do so. If he had the might, then it means he had the right. Right was simply determined by your ability and your power. So this sexual violence that he practiced came to be known as sadism, right? So that's where we get the term sadism, and then later on sadomasochism. So this is the Marquis de Sade. Now, the idea that life is meaningless in modern times is conveyed by the trilogy, the movie trilogy, The Matrix. Has anyone seen The Matrix? You're all familiar with The Matrix, right? So The Matrix is a metaphor for a nihilistic order, right? So what you have is machines which humans built, use humans as a source of energy, right? While the human beings are providing energy by being connected to these machines, the human beings are hooked up to a computer program, which humans are sleeping, in other words, but being hooked up to a computer program, and sort of through the computer program living a simulated life. So everything is like this, you know, everything seems real, but actually I'm not here, you are not here. We are actually in some big, we're in some building hooked up to a machine providing energy, and we are sleeping, and through a computer program dreaming a simulated life. That's the idea of the Matrix. Now, it exaggerates the idea of being alienated from human potential. It exaggerates it, but there is a lot in our life which is like that. For example, think about it. Think about which areas of your life are simulated. When you go for enjoyment, leisure, you go to a simulated environment. For example, you go to an amusement park, right? You go to, what do they call these things? Not Hollywood. Theme parks like Universal Studios and so on and so forth, right? So these are simulated realities, actually. Now, if you know the Matrix, people live in bliss because they do not realize that their life is a simulation. But when some people realize that they are actually not living life, but actually living a simulated life, then they realize that they are alienated from their true humanity. That realization of not having the ability to realize your humanity is what is called alienation, consciousness of alienation, And it is also what brings despair. Despair, a sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness, not being able to realize your full human potential. Now, Nursi clearly saw the benefit of science and technology and modern civilization. He also recognized that these were virtues of European civilization. At the same time, and this is quite the opposite, he found Europe to be, quote, a noxious, dissolute civilization, informed by a meaningless, harmful philosophy. So here I think it's very clear that Nursi is referring to what, although he didn't use the term, but he's referring to what we might call nihilism. He says about Europe, you hold a diseased and misguided philosophy in your right hand and a harmful and corrupt civilization in your left, and claim mankind's happiness is with these two, and so on. Now, Nursi's summary of the problem of European civilization is presented in a collection of aphorisms called the Seeds of Reality. And Nursi says that modern civilization is founded on 5 negative principles. Its point of support is force and aggression. Its aim and goal is benefit. Its principle in life is conflict. The bond between the masses is racialism and negative nationalism. And finally, its enticing service is inciting lust and passion and gratifying the desires. These are very broad, I think these 5 principles sort of encompass what Nursi feels is wrong with modern civilization. Now, how can we conceptualize Nursi's statement on the central problem of modern civilization? So I would like to suggest that at the heart of Nursi's claim is the marginalization of God from humanity's concerns, or what we may refer to as the phenomenon of desacralization or disenchantment. This follows logically from Nursi's criticism of the dominance of naturalism in modern civilization, philosophy according to which everything is explained in terms of natural causes. As a result, as Nursi says, minds become strangers to non-material explanation. I'm not suggesting that Nursi directly addresses the problem of nihilism, or that he was consciously engaging the problem of nihilism. But although the issue had already been discussed during his time in Europe and in Russia. But I would say that Nursi was acutely aware of the problem of meaninglessness in life, and that he related this meaninglessness to the expunging of spiritual matters from the concern of modern humans. Now, despair is an important theme in social theory and in philosophy, particularly since the 19th century, and continues to be an important phenomenon today. It is also a theme that was mentioned by Nursi through the concept of yas. Now, despair is related to other human conditions such as alienation and anomie. I don't have the time to go into the definition of alienation and anomie. But if we were to talk about the main concepts that thinkers since the 19th century have used to describe the modern human condition, or the problem, the central problem of humanity, they would be concepts like formal rationalization, trapping human beings into a cage of rationality. It means the excessive bureaucratization of life. That would be one concept. The other is alienation, where humans are alienated from their ability to be fully human. Another concept is anomie, which refers to human beings being enslaved by desire rather than being able to control their desire. And another concept is the idea of nihilism, the idea of another concept is despair, the idea that life, there is no meaning and point to human existence. And the result of that, the consequence of that, is a sense of despair. Now, this being the problem that Nihilism is recognized as a problem by Western thinkers, by Nursi. How have thinkers responded to this problem? What do thinkers say we should do? How should we deal with our nihilistic conditions? Now this part, of course, is very interesting. There are many responses. Now, one response is that, well, if life is meaningless, if there's no God, there's no point to human existence, we can commit suicide. And indeed, there is a philosophy which suggests that we can commit suicide, that people are free and should be free to take their own lives. Well, so I won't go into the details. There is also another response, which is resignation. Accept it. You know, this relates to Albert Camus' story of the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that Sisyphus is punished by a god, condemned to roll a stone up a hill, only for the stone to roll back down. And he would, you know, interminably spend his whole life, rolling the stone up the hill, only for it to roll down. He will never succeed in the task. Now, Sisyphus can continue to live because he has no hope that he will ever complete the task of keeping the stone up the hill. If he were to hope and never achieve his goal, he would be in despair and he would not be able to live. So the idea is to just resign yourself to the meaninglessness of life. Right? Then you have the existentialists. The existentialists who say, yes, life is meaningless, but it is up to us to search, to construct meaning and to search for meaning. And then here you have a distinction between the atheist existentialist and the religious existentialist. Right? And so I would argue actually that many of the Muslim scholars, Nursi being one of them, is actually a religious existentialist, because he recognizes the issue of the absurdity, the meaninglessness of life, in the sense that you know, modern the kind of life that modern capitalist society has created. So our experience of life is such that there is meaninglessness and chaos and absurdity, but it is our tasks as human beings who believe, to construct meaning in life. And then you also have another response, which is a response of nihilism, meaning embrace the meaninglessness. Embrace it, because the reality is that not only that life is meaningless, but there is no basis for it to be otherwise. There is no God, there is no creator, and we have artificially created meaning. We have created rules and regulations and morality. These are all human constructions, and there are no consequences if we break these rules. So we should just live as we want to live. So this is, you know, kind of a nihilistic approach. It's not simply recognizing nihilism in life. It is taking a nihilistic view about life, and that is the approach of the Marquis de Sade, you know, the guy I mentioned earlier. Now, so I'm concluding now. Obviously, Nursi's approach is to lead a life which attempts to derive meaning, to construct meaning, and doing that requires basically being happy. But then when Nursi says happiness, he means true happiness is to be found in the belief in God and loving Him. I'm actually quoting from Professor Ibrahim Özdemir, who wrote a paper on Nursi and Jean-Paul Sartre on existentialism. Ibrahim Özdemir quotes from Nursi. This quote is from Nursi, but I got it from Ibrahim Özdemir's work, that true happiness comes from belief in God and in recognizing Him and loving Him, Along these lines, Nursi says that the highest aim of creation and its most important result is belief in God. The most exalted rank in humanity and its highest degree is the knowledge of God contained within belief in God. The most radiant happiness and sweetest bounty for jinn and human beings is the love of God contained within the knowledge of God. And finally, the purest joy for the human spirit and the sheerest delight for man's heart is the rapture of the spirit contained within the love of God. Now, again, I can't go into the detail, there's no time, but I want to make a critical point here, and I'll end with that. I think we can all agree with Nursi and with other thinkers that the idea of happiness, sa'ada, is our ultimate goal, right? Both for spiritual and material well-being in this world as well as in the hereafter. Professor Nagib Alatas says that the opposite of happiness is shaqawa. Shaqawa, kind of misery, kind of sense of misery. Obviously, sa'ada or happiness is our goal. But my point is this, and this is a question that I will ask, that I would like to ask. Is it sufficient to assert that we need to believe in God, and to believe in God in this way to the point of certainty, such that we have happiness and we are relieved of distress, we are relieved of yas, of despair, we are relieved of shaqawa? Is it sufficient to assert this, or do we need to do more in order to create the conditions that allow for that? Because we talk at one level, at the level of theory, about how we must have belief and certainty of yaqeen in God, and how this will result in happiness. At one level we talk, but we look at the reality. Now, look at the reality of our lives. There is this psychologist, Abraham Maslow, he has this idea of this hierarchy of needs. He says that to be a fulfilled human being, you need to have, first of all, psychological, you have your psychological needs need to be fulfilled. Food, water, yes, I'll finish, yes. I came many hours, by flight, so give me 1 or 2 minutes, please. Psychological needs, food, water, shelter, and protection from the elements, from rain, from heat and cold and so on. We also need safety, security, stability, freedom from fear. Yes? We also need love from our friends, from our family, from others. And then comes, other needs such as self-esteem. We need, to have some degree of self-esteem through some sense of achievement, some recognition by our peers. And for that, we need to be good in things. We need to have some mastery over certain things so that we have respect and so on. And finally, the highest level, the highest need, self-actualization. Meaning, and I think it's very important, I don't think the ulama stress this at all. I don't think the ulama actually discuss this. This is discussed very widely in Western civilization, among artists, among philosophers, among psychologists. This idea of self-actualization, that a basic character of humans is their need to create, to produce, to put something of themselves in objects of reality, whether it is writing, whether it is cooking, whether it is doing art, or even working, right? Our work has to be meaningful. If you are good with your hands, but you spend your life making things that you're not interested in. Why? You are making it in a factory for the employer who's going to sell what you make. You have no connection with the thing you are making. Or you have a talent in writing. You write, but you don't write what you feel, because you are writing for a magazine or a newspaper, or you're writing for people who want you to write something else. then you have no connection between, you know, your heart, what's in your heart, and what you write. There's no ability to self-actualize. So all I'm saying is, and this is my last sentence, that it's all very fine to talk about happiness, sa'ada, at the theoretical level, but not talk about how we can actually create an environment, create a society where people can actually fulfill all these different needs, including the need to self-actualization. Look at our societies. Not only the West, but it's worse in our own societies. It's worse in our own societies. I can talk about my students. I can talk about these things with my students and tell my students you need to self-actualize and this and that, but they cannot even get a decent education in their university because the universities are so corrupt. There's plagiarism among the professors. I'm talking about in Malaysia. Because of corruption, there's lack of funding. The best professors are not hired in the universities, and so on and so forth. So how do you bring, and how do you tell people you must have yaqeen in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you must reach a stage of sa'ada and so on and so forth, when the basic conditions in society are not there for people to self-actualize themselves. So I think this really is our challenge to overcome the problem of nihilism in modern society. Thank you very much.